Hello, YouTube. This is Kid 02 here. I'm finally gonna do the second cassette to Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Since I did the first cassette 2 weeks ago, now I have the time to do the second cassette. So, this is no copyright intended, just for enjoyment. Enjoy.
He moved closer to Indy, jutting out his square jaw. I'm going to be drinking to my own health when he's gone the way of the dodo. He pulled a pistol from his pocket and aimed it between Indy's eyes. He took a step backward. The Grail is mine, and you're going to get it for me. Indy grinned, feigning indifference. Aren't you forgetting about Dr. Schneider? Donovan smiled. She comes with the Grail. Too bad for you. Indy's eyes strayed to Elsa, who was standing a few steps behind Donovan. Her face was a mask. Lovely, soft, a riddle. Donovan cocked the pistol. Move. Indy pointed at the gun. Shooting me won't get you anywhere. Donovan knew he was right. For a moment he didn't answer. Then his eyes slid to Henry and back again to Indy, and a slow smile spread across his face. You know something, Dr. Jones? I totally agree with you. You're absolutely right. He turned to Henry, aimed the gun at him. No! Elsa and Indy yelled simultaneously. But Donovan fired, hitting him in the stomach at point-blank range. Henry's hands covered his stomach. He stumbled and turned toward Indy. Dad? Elsa ran forward. Donovan caught her and shoved her back. Stay out of this! Henry collapsed in his son's arms. Brody and Sala rushed over as Indy gently lowered him to the ground. Sala cradled Henry's head, and Brody knelt down next to him. Indy ripped open his father's shirt. The gaping wound nearly made him gag. Brody pushed a handkerchief into Indy's hand, and he pressed it against the father's abdomen. He held it there to slow the bleeding, and then he noticed the bullet had exited through his father's side, where there was more blood. He spoke softly to him, telling him it was going to be all right. Really it was, and hoped to God that his voice was convincing. Get up, Jones, Donovan snapped. Indy whipped his head around, hate filling his eyes, and leapt to his feet as Brody cradled Henry. He was about to go for Donovan's throat, then hesitated when Donovan cocked his weapon. You can't save him if you're dead, Donovan said, training the gun on Indy's heart. The healing power of the Grail is the only thing that can save your father now. He paused a moment. Do you doubt me? It's time to ask yourself what to believe. Henry groaned. He coughed. He turned and knelt next to his father again. Brody whispered that Henry was badly injured. Indy nodded. The Grail is the only chance you've got, Donovan said, smiling with certainty that Indy would accept the challenge, that Indy did not in fact even have a choice. Indy looked up at Brody. He's right. The Grail can save him, Indy. I believe it. You must too. Under other circumstances, Indy might have laughed at the idea. But this was his father, and he was dying. He nodded to Brody, then reached in his pouch for the Grail diary. He was about to stand up when Henry's hand fell on his wrist. Remember, the breath of God. I will, Dad, and I'll get the Grail. For you. Indy opened the Grail diary and looked down at it. The light was dim, and the writing a blur, but he had to find a way past the arch, the breath of God. His father was lying on the ground, bleeding to death. He had to help him. He had to get the Grail cup and bring it back as fast as he could. Rationally, he knew no ancient cup could heal a bullet wound, but that didn't matter. He had had enough strange experiences in his life to know that things that weren't supposed to happen sometimes did. Maybe the healing capacity of the Grail Cup could never be proven, could never be repeated in the scientific setting, but he was willing to try. He took 2 more steps. He could hear his father calling out to him. Indy turned and saw Henry's eyes glazed, looking up at him. He listened. His father was muttering the phrase over and over. Only the penitent man will pass. Only the penitent man will pass. Only the penitent man will pass. Indy repeated it to himself and carefully climbed the remainder of the steps. The corpses were a few feet in front of him. The top steps were soaked with blood. He took another step toward the arch and then 1 more. He could see down the passageway beyond the arch. He stopped, sensing that he was only a pace away from being beheaded. Penitent, only the penitent man will pass, he whispered. Only the penitent man will pass. He noticed a huge cobweb across the archway just ahead of him. Why hadn't he seen it before? Neither of the men had reached the cobweb. He knew that, whatever it was, the breath of God lay between him and the cobweb. Only the penitent man will pass. Penitent. Penitent. A penitent man. He started to take a step forward, but held his foot in midair like an oversized bird at rest. Penitent. The penitent man is humble before God. The penitent man kneels before God. Kneel. He set his foot down and fell to his knees. As he did so, he heard a loud whooshing overhead, and he instinctively tumbled forward. He lay there on his stomach a moment, then slowly rolled over. He peered up, and now he could see it above him, a razor-sharp triple pendulum, and it was still whirring just inches above him. The pendulum was attached to a pair of wooden wheels connected to the inside of the stone arch. It was probably activated by the slightest breath of air created by a person's movement, and stopped after it struck its target. The pendulum had been there for centuries and still operated perfectly, as if under a spell. This part at least he could understand. He knew it would take millennia before anything disintegrated in this desert. He had seen bodies thousands of years old that had been discovered under the desert sands. The skin was still on the bones and the clothing intact, with the threads appearing as if they had only recently been woven. And he saw a rope hanging from one of the wheels. Worked his way over to the side of the arch. He grabbed the rope and hooked the loop end over one of the spokes on the nearest wheel. Instantly the mechanism ground to a halt, and the blades jammed. He looked up toward the passageway, wishing Indy luck. And then he noticed Donovan, followed by Elsa, climbing the steps. Those wretched schemers, perfectly abhorrent, he muttered. Henry suddenly rose up slightly and spoke in a raspy voice. The Word of God! The Word of God! No, Henry, try not to talk, Brody said. A spasm of pain shot through Henry's body, and Brody feared they were going to lose him. In the name of God, Henry croaked. He relaxed a bit as the pain eased. Jehovah, he muttered. But in the Latin alphabet, Jehovah begins with an I. His body was racked by another jolt of pain. Oh dear, he said, sucking in his breath. Sala placed a hand on his shoulder and glanced up at the passageway. It's okay, Henry. Indy lit a match, held it up to the Grail diary, and translated the phrase from Latin. The second challenge, the Word of God. Only in the footsteps of God will he proceed. The match winked out. Indy stood in the darkness and gazed ahead, wondering what the words meant. When he reached the challenge, he hoped he would recognize it in time to save his life. At least with the first one, with the pendulum, he had had the advantage of 2 failed attempts ahead of him. With this one, he was truly in the dark. Only in the footsteps of God will he proceed, he said, memorizing the words, the Word of God. The Word of God. What could it mean? He lit another match and read the rest of the section. Proceed in the footsteps of the Word. In the name of God, Jehovah. He heard a noise and looked back to see Donovan and Elsa. They stood just beyond the entrance to the passageway, waiting for him to make his next move. Parasites, Andy thought. Don't stop now, Dr. Jones, Donovan said derisively. You've just begun your journey. He turned and continued along the passageway until he came to a checkerboard of cobblestones. Cobbles. He remembered the word from the diary. It was on the page with the diagrams. Pendulum, cobbles, and something about a bridge. He held the match up to get a better look at the pattern of stones. Each one was marked with a letter. The Word of God. Proceed in the footsteps of the Word of God, Jehovah. He stepped tentatively on the shade. Suddenly his foot plunged through a hole, and he almost lost his balance. He steadied himself, pulled his leg out. As he did, he felt something crawling on his ankle. He quickly shook his foot back and then brushed off a fist-sized, hairy black spider. It scrambled down the passage, a plump, hideous thing, and a moment later Elsa shrieked. She did better with the rats under the library. He looked back at the diagram and shook his head in disgust as he realized his mistake. Okay, wake up, pay attention. We're not dealing with English. The Latin Jehovah begins with an I. He lit another match and made a quick search of the cobblestones, and then, saying the letters out loud, he jumped across them from stone to stone. As he landed on the O, his foot slipped partially onto the stone with the letter P. Instantly it dropped down. He wobbled, regained his balance, and stepped across the last two letters. He had made it. He looked back and saw Elsa and Donovan approaching the cobblestones. He wasn't going to give them any hints, but Elsa had already figured it out from what she had overheard him repeat from the Grail entries and what she had seen him do on the cobbles. She smiled at him and stepped ahead as if she were playing hopscotch. I-E-H-O-V-A, Jehovah. Indy scraped cobwebs from his hat, turned, and walked on. Behind, he heard Donovan yelling for Elsa to go on to keep Indy in sight, and then he was right behind her. Sala knew Henry was slipping fast. He was no longer talking to himself or moving. His breath was so shallow it was nearly inaudible. He felt for a pulse on the side of Henry's neck, and then he glanced up at Brody and shook his head. I'm afraid that he's... No, he can't die, Brody said. He glanced toward the steps. I'm going for Indy. He's got to hurry. There's no time to waste. Sala watched him run up the steps, thinking that Brody was acting as delirious as Henry. Father of Indy, stay with us a little longer. Your son will come soon. Your son will come. He muttered a prayer to himself as his eyes turned upward to the heavens. And as he finished, he heard a voice. It was Henry. He leaned over, pleased that God had answered his prayer so fast. Father of Indy, what are you saying? You must believe, boy, you must believe. You have to believe. Believe. Have to believe. Indy stood at the edge of an abyss, holding on to the rock wall for support. The passage had abruptly ended. Across the gulf was a triangular-shaped opening, and on the rock facing above it was a carved lion's head. The path of God. Then Indy remembered what it said in the diary. Only in the leap from the lion's head will he prove his worth. He looked down into the abyss and then across to the rock face. No, it was too far to leap. Nobody could make that jump. The pendulum, the cobbles, the invisible bridge. The third diagram had been wedge-shaped with a series of dotted lines leading across the top of the wedge. But it didn't make sense. He didn't believe in invisible bridges. Indy! He turned at the sound of Brody's voice coming from inside the passageway. Marcus, he yelled back. Indy, you've got to hurry. He leaned his head back against the rock wall and closed his eyes. He could turn around now and go back and watch his father die, or he could jump. and hope, even though there was no hope. I believe. I believe. I believe I can hit it. I'll do it. I can hit the bullseye. I believe. I'll do it. And he did believe. He stared across the abyss again, but now there was no time to question the power of his faith. I've got to believe. That's the only way. The only way I can make it. I believe it. He stuffed the diary in his pouch and focused on the rock wall on the far side, saying over and over again that he believed. If I don't believe, I won't jump. I'll jump when I believe. He brushed aside his doubts, concentrating and repeating his belief until he felt the grooves of that faith etched inside him. His breathing was deep, but it was coming faster and faster. I can do it. Dad, I can do it. I'll make it. He crouched down on the edge of the abyss with every bit of his strength. He pushed off and sprang like a lion. It was a strong leap, the best he could have done, but of course it was far too short. The gap was too wide. He was going to die. Yet he knew he wouldn't. He looked down and saw he was on a rock ledge a few feet below the passageway. But why hadn't he seen it? It was obviously there all the time. He leaned back slightly, tried to look at the ledge from the perspective of the opposite wall, and then he saw there was something unusual about the rocks. It was ingenious. The ledge was colored to blend exactly with the rocks 100 feet below. From the sideline on the opposite wall, it appeared that there was no ledge. It was a perfect camouflage until he leaped. He laughed aloud. He had believed, and he had found the impossible, the invisible bridge. If he hadn't believed he could survive, he would never have leaped and never found the bridge. He stood, wobbled a moment, looked back across the abyss. He saw Elsa and Donovan staring at him in astonishment. He chuckled, knowing that from their perspective, he looked as if he was standing in midair. Gingerly, he followed the ledge as it gradually rose, a gentle slope that ended beneath the lion's head. He was now just below the lip of the aperture in the rock wall. And then he remembered something else. Lion was one of the symbols of the search for the Grail, a fifth level of awareness. It stood for leadership, conquest, and the attainment of high goals. He had overcome the 3 challenges. A high goal had been achieved. Now he was ready to move on and find the Grail Cup. He had the feeling, though, that the toughest challenge of them all was still ahead. Indy looked back once before pressing on and saw Elsa throwing pebbles and dirt out over the abyss and onto the invisible bridge. Bright woman, bright and dangerous. The passageway narrowed and the ceiling lowered as he continued forward. He banged his head on the ceiling, scraped his shoulders on the walls. He was forced to crawl, but it didn't do much good. He still banged his head. Darkness wrapped around him like a thick overcoat. His fingers led the way, penetrating the darkness ahead. He worried that when he reached the end, it would be a rock wall. And then what? He hadn't overcome the challenges just to find out that there was no Grail, only a dead end. And this was no time for cosmic jokes. His father was dying. He banged his forehead and, fearing the worst, extended his arms and patted the wall with his hand, defining the contours of the tunnel. He realized it was curving, not ending. He moved slowly ahead and noticed the tunnel was now dimly lit. He crawled another 10 feet. He could see a light ahead and moved faster. The light grew stronger, brighter. He squinted as brilliant sunshine beamed into the tunnel. Then, forcing his way through a narrow opening, he tumbled out of the tunnel. Sweet, fragrant air swirled about him. His eyes quickly adjusted to the daylight. He stood, brushed the dirt off his shoulders, stretched his arms and legs. He was inside another temple, smaller than the other. His attention immediately focused on an altar in the center. It was draped in violet linen, and on it were dozens of chalices of various sizes. Some were gold, others were silver, Some were festooned with precious jewels, others were less ornate, but all of them shone and glistened, and Indy was mesmerized by the spectacle. He knew he had reached his destination. He moved forward for a closer look, and then saw another smaller altar off to the side, and something else, a figure in a tunic and a knit headdress knelt in front of the other altar with his back to him. And he walked closer. The man's thin, bony hands were folded, his head bent in prayer. The skin on his fingers was paper-thin, translucent, and outlined the bones. He moved forward and saw a shaft of light striking the emblem of a cross that was stitched on the man's tunic. And he realized he was looking up at the third Grail Knight, the brother who stayed behind to guard the cup. He bent over, looked into the knight's face. His eyes were closed. His parched lips were slightly parted as if he were about to say something. The face had heavy white eyebrows and a prominent nose. The body was dried and brittle by time and the desert, yet remarkably preserved, in a far better condition than the gruesome remains of the knight's brother from the catacombs in Venice. He leaned forward and frowned. For a moment he thought he saw the knight blink, and then he smiled and shook his head. A candle was burning on the altar in front of the knight, and the flickering light was playing tricks with his eyes. And he raised his head. A candle. Who lit that? He lifted his gaze and looked around the temple, wondering if he was being watched. So who lit the candle, old fellow? The knight suddenly raised his head. Indy drew back astonished. What the hell? He watched in stunned disbelief as the knight rose slowly to his feet and then lifted an enormous sword with both hands. Before Indy even realized what had happened, the sword flashed in the air. The knight swung the weapon quickly, deftly, and the tip of it nicked the front of Indy's shirt and sliced the strap of his pouch, which slipped to the ground. Indy leaped back as the knight hefted the sword again and took another swipe at him. This time the weight of the sword was too much. The knight lost his balance. He stumbled back against the altar. The sword clattered as it struck the rock floor. Indy moved over to him and helped him up. He was old, but possessed an unmistakable vitality that made his eyes gleam. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. It was as if he were uncertain how to speak. Finally he uttered a low groan. I knew you would come, he said, looking Indy over, judging him against some image in his own mind. But my strength has left me. I tire easily. Who are you? Indy answered slowly. You know who I be, the last of three brothers who swore an oath to find and protect the Grail. That was more than 800 years ago. A long time to wait. Indy smiled affably. The old guy was senile. So when was the first crusade? At first, Indy didn't think the old man heard him, and then he answered, in the year of our Lord, 1095, at the Council of Clermont, proclaimed by Pope Urban II. When did the Crusades end? The knight gave him a withering look that reminded Indy of his father. They have not. The last Crusader stands before ye eyes. Indy nodded. He didn't have time to interrogate him, though. He needed to act. If this guy was the real thing and still alive, then the Grail Cup could save his father. He heard voices coming from the tunnel and started to turn, but the old knight tugged on the brim of his fedora. Ye be strangely dressed for a knight. He ran his fingers over Indy's bullwhip. Well, I'm not exactly a knight. I think ye be one. Indy shrugged. I was chosen as the bravest and most worthy. The honor of guarding the Grail was made mine until another worthy knight arrived to challenge me in single combat. He lifted the hilt of his sword. I pass it to ye who vanquished me. Look, let me explain. I need to borrow the Grail cup from you. You see, my father... Hold it, Jones. And he looked around to see Donovan squeezing through the tunnel, aiming his pistol at him. Stop right there. Donovan glanced around, saw the altar of chalices, and moved over to it. Elsa emerged from the tunnel and quickly joined him. Donovan glanced over at the knight. His gun was still aimed at Indy. Okay, which one is it? The knight took a step forward and rose to his full height as he stared at Donovan. I no longer serve as guardian of the Grail. He nodded toward Indy. It is he who must answer the challenge. I will neither help nor hinder. Donovan grinned at Indy. He's not stopping me. Then choose wisely, the knight advised. But just as the true Grail will bring a life, the false Grail will take it away. Indy smiled wryly at Donovan. Take your pick, Donovan. Good luck. Elsa moved closer to the altar. Do you see it? Donovan asked under his breath. Yes. Which is it? Elsa removed her hat and carefully picked up a shiny cup encrusted with sparkling colored stones. Donovan instantly grabbed it from her and held it up to the light. Oh yes, it's more beautiful than I had ever imagined, and it's mine. Indy expected Elsa to protest, but she remained silent. The knight's face was implacable, revealing nothing. Donovan looked up toward a font and carried the cup over to it. Elsa followed him. Indy knew that according to the legend, immortality was achieved by drinking water from the cup. Donovan admired the cup again. This certainly is the cup of a king of kings. Now it's mine. He filled it with water and held it high in one hand. He gazed triumphantly at Indy and the knight. The gun was still in his other hand, but in his excitement, he no longer aimed it at Indy. Eternal life. He drank long and deeply. Donovan lowered the cup to his chest. His eyes were closed and a beatific smile spread across his face. Indy could have tackled him at that moment and wrestled the cup from him, but something inside him told him to wait and watch. He didn't have to wait long. Suddenly, Donovan's eyes opened wide. The hand that held the cup started to shake. He turned away and bent over the font, his face skewed in pain. His body shuddered. He dropped the gun. With a great effort, he pushed away from the font and stumbled toward the altar. He stood several feet short of it, unable to take another step. What is happening to me? His features contorted in a grisly mask. His skin shriveled and wrinkled. He looked frail and already ancient when he turned to Elsa, the cup still clutched in his hand. His eyes seemed to have sunk into his cheeks and lay there like old stones in dry sockets. He then hurled himself toward her, hands digging into her shoulder. What is happening? She screamed and tried to push him away from her as he kept repeating his question, his voice growing fainter by the second, his body aging rapidly. His hair was growing long and gray and crisp. His face was sinking, his skin peeling away. Elsa shrieked in terror. Donovan's fingernails curled back on themselves. Milky cataracts coated his eyes. What remained of his skin turned brown and leathery and stretched across his face until it split and hung in flaps. Then he crumpled to the ground, an ancient skeleton blackened with age. Indy moved quickly to Elsa's side and pushed her away from the still writhing remains. He kicked a pile of bones and cloth, and Donovan's skeletal arms fluttered, collapsed, and turned to dust. Elsa clung to Indy, her face pressed against his shirt, sobbing as a cold wind swirled through the temple and gradually died away. Indy peered over Elsa's shoulder, looking at the pile of dust that had been Donovan, and as she began to calm down, Indy let go of her, turned to the knight, an unspoken question on his face. He chose poorly, the old knight said. and shrugged as if Donovan's death was no consequence to him. He had given him fair warning. End of side 3.
Side 4 coming. Enjoy.
Indy glanced at Elsa, picked up the gun Donovan had dropped, and tucked it in his belt, and then he hurried over to the altar. He was thinking of his father dying back there, his father bleeding and in pain. He stood in front of the chalices, took several deep breaths, and let his eyes unfocus. A feeling of acute awareness overtook him. He felt lightheaded. He closed his eyes a moment, concentrating, telling himself that he could do it. He could select the correct grail, the one that would save his father. He opened his eyes, cast a quick glance over the rows of glittering, bejeweled chalices, and then his eyes came to rest on one that was different. It was a simple cup, dull compared to the others. He didn't know why, but it seemed right. He picked it up and looked it over carefully. He didn't know what he expected to find. He knew there wouldn't be any stamp of authenticity. Is that it? Elsa asked. I guess there's only one way to find out. And he moved quickly to the font, scooped up some of the water. He breathed deeply, took a quick drink from the cup, and waited an instant, wondering if something were going to happen, if he was looking at the last few seconds of his own life. He didn't feel any different, or better, or worse. Then suddenly his vision blurred. He felt dizzy. He blinked and squeezed his eyes shut. God, had he chosen wrong? Oddly, he realized he could still see, but it was a different way of seeing. The cup in his hands was growing, transforming. It grew wings, a head, a beak. It was an eagle, spreading its massive wings and taking flight. It was the eagle of his vision quest, and the eagle that signaled the sixth and last level of awareness in the Grail search. Indy? At the sound of Elsa's voice, he blinked and shook his head. The cup was still in his hand. He glanced over at Elsa. From the questioning look on her face, he knew that she hadn't shared his experience. He looked over at the knight, who smiled knowingly. You have chosen wisely. That was all the verification Indy needed. He didn't wait a second longer. He headed directly for the tunnel and crawled through it. He moved as rapidly as he could, while still carefully balancing the water-filled Grail cup. He was hurrying, thinking about his father and not paying enough attention. He was halfway across when his right foot slipped on the pebbles and dirt. His legs swung out, and he tottered back and forth, the Grail cup wavering precariously over the abyss. Just as he almost regained his balance, his other foot slipped, and he fell unceremoniously onto his butt. Miraculously, only a few drops had wet the sides of the Grail cup. He carefully stood up, cautiously walked to the other side. Brody stood at the top of the steps, looking anxiously at Sala and Henry in the dark passageway. There was still no sign of Indy, and he knew Henry couldn't last much longer. He looked up, peered down the passageway, and saw Indy moving quickly toward him, clutching the Grail cup in his hands. His eyes widened, and his face lit up. He stepped back as Indy rushed past him and down the steps. He moved forward and was about to follow Indy when he nearly collided with Elsa as she rushed out the passageway. By the time he reached the bottom of the steps, Indy was on his knees beside his father, and the soldiers had closed around him. Brody pushed his way through the soldiers as if they were no consequence. They were without a leader now, and simply watched out of curiosity. Brody crouched down, helped Sala lift Henry's head. Indy quickly put the cup to Henry's lips. Henry was too weak even to open his eyes. Indy poured. but the water just ran down the side of Henry's mouth. "Come on, Dad. Dad, come on. Drink. Please drink, Dad. Drink." He had swallowed some of the water. He was sure of it. Indy then carefully removed the emergency dressing from Henry's wound and poured some of the water over it. Quickly he placed the cup to his father's lips again and poured some more water down his throat. And they waited. Indy was certain his father's breathing was growing stronger. He leaned over and listened to his heartbeat. It was steady and resolute. He could almost see and feel his father coming back to them. Suddenly, Henry's eyes fluttered open. They focused first on Sala, and then Brody, and then his son. And finally they settled on the Grail cup. Indy smiled, feeling a certainty in his heart that his father was out of danger. He probably would never be able to convince his skeptical colleagues that water from an ancient cup had healed his father, and there would be plenty of doubts and controversy over whether this was the real Grail cup. But so what? He knew. That's what mattered. He had seen and experienced the beauty and power of the Grail. In doing so, he had ascended in his own quest from cynicism to doubt to awakening. The quest was fulfilled, and with it the last crusade finally neared its end. Henry's hands shook as he reached out for the Grail cup, but now it was from excitement, not weakness. The color had returned to his face, and his eyes were wide open, clear, cognizant. His wound had been covered again, but it was no longer bleeding, and didn't seem to be causing him any great discomfort. As Indy proudly passed his father the Grail cup, he heard a clatter behind him. He jerked his head around and saw the soldiers dropping their weapons and shrinking back. Their curiosity had turned to fear. They didn't want anything to do with guarding the wizards who had performed the miraculous healing, and suddenly all of them fled the temple. All but a couple of the Nazi soldiers immediately gave chase, and shouting and threatening to shoot the men, but they kept on running. Sala swiftly made the most of it. As the two remaining Nazis called to their companions, he stealthily made his way toward the nearest rifle. He swept up, spun around, and ordered the remaining Nazis to drop their weapons. "Die Gewehr herunter!" he repeated when they momentarily hesitated. "Do as he says," Elsa snapped at them. They hesitated, but not for long. They set down their weapons and raised their hands. Sala, however, didn't realize that another Nazi had stayed behind and was standing a few feet behind Elsa. As the soldier reached for his pistol, Indy dove for his legs, tackling him. The Nazi twisted about and turned his gun on Indy. He was about to fire when Elsa kicked the weapon from his hand. Indy rose up on one knee, gazing at Elsa, amazed and baffled at what she'd done. The Nazi took advantage of the moment and punched him. Indy grabbed his jaw, frowned, then collared the Nazi and landed a punch that was hard and direct. The soldier flopped to the ground and rolled over. Indy stood up and smiled at Elsa. He didn't know what to make of her. On one hand, there was abundant evidence of her deceitfulness, yet she had just saved his life. Elsa's complacent look abruptly turned to horror. Her mouth dropped open, quivered a moment. "Watch out! Behind you!" Indy turned just in time to block the arm of the same Nazi as he stabbed at him with a long, vicious-looking knife. Sala ordered the soldier to drop it. The man looked up at the rifle barrel, his eyes flicked to Sala's face, and he released the knife. Indy grabbed it and spun the Nazi around. "Go join your buddies!" He pushed him roughly toward the other two Nazis. Indy looked over at his father and realized that when Sala left him, he had remained sitting up, holding the Grail cup to his stomach. Indy started to ask him how he felt, but Henry was gazing past him, eyes glazed, a rapturous expression on his face. Now what? Slowly Indy turned and saw the Grail Knight standing on the steps. "I know you," Henry called out to the knight. "Yes, I know you. We were comrades in arms." "No, from the books. You're the third knight, the one who stayed behind. But I don't understand. You had the Grail cup. Why are you so old?" The knight descended the rest of the stairs. "Many times my spirit faltered, and I could not bear to drink from the cup, so I aged. a year for every day I did not drink. But now, at last, I am released to death with honor, for this brave knight-errant cometh to take my place. Indy looked from the knight to his father, uneasiness churning a path through his gut. Dad, there's a misunderstanding here. I don't really... He is not a knight-errant, Henry Scott. He's just my errant son who has led an impure life, unworthy of the honor you bestow. Indy nodded. Oh, yes, an impure life. Totally unworthy. Son, do something worthy and help your father stand up. Henry set the Grail cup down and wrapped an arm over Indy's shoulder. You sure you want to try this, Dad? Of course, I'm feeling better by the moment. Brody took the other side, and they gently lifted Henry to his feet. His father was alive, and they knew each other now as never before. He watched as the knight stepped closer and peered into Henry's face. Is it you then, brother? Are ye the knight who will relieve me? Alas, no. I am but a scholar. The knight gestured toward Brody. Is it you, brother? Me? The knight looked baffled and walked over to Sala, who had herded the Nazi guards away from the others and was still keeping an eye on them. He placed a hand on Sala's shoulder, apparently confident that he'd found his replacement. Ah, good night. Sala didn't understand. He looked at Indy. He said, good night. Sala nodded to the old man. Yes, good night. Sleep tight. Indy bent down, picked up Henry's hat, tie, and watch. He froze as he saw Elsa out of the corner of his eye, inching closer to the Grail cup. Suddenly, she took 2 quick steps, grabbed the cup in both hands, and held it up. She gazed at it as if in a trance. Her eyes were fixed on it with such an intensity that Indy finally understood that nothing else truly mattered to her. Not him, not the Fuhrer, not anyone. She was obsessed by the Grail. Indy was distracted by the old knight who stepped in front of him. Why have these strange knights come, he muttered, if not to challenge me? He shook his head, bewildered, and walked away as Indy rose to his feet. For this, you fool, Elsa answered. She clutched the Grail cup to her chest and bolted for the entrance of the temple. Indy was about to give chase when he stopped and turned. She was a few feet from the entrance of the temple, silhouetted in the late afternoon light. She must have realized, he thought, that she wouldn't get far in the desert on her own. We've got it. Come on, let's go. No, the knight yelled. The Grail can never leave this place. Never. He looked over at Indy and Henry. Remaining here is the price of immortality. Henry glanced from the knight to Elsa. Listen to him. He knows. The Grail will be nothing but an old cup if you take it from the temple. I don't believe him. You must not cross the seal, the knight warned, pointing past her. Elsa turned and took several defiant steps toward the entrance. She will pay dearly, the knight said quietly. Wait, Indy shouted, running after her. The images of what happened to Donovan were still fresh in his mind. Wait, Elsa, don't move. She neared a large metal seal on the floor, but paid no attention to it. She was not only captivated, but overwhelmed by the Grail cup, and her eyes were glued to it. Elsa! He reached her just in time and grabbed her arm. She peered up at him with those incredibly blue eyes of hers, and he felt something shift and slide in his chest. It's ours now, Indy, she said softly. Ours? Don't you understand? Yours and mine. No one else matters. Donovan is dead. We'll keep it from the Fuhrer. He shook his head. It is staying here. With sudden and unexpected strength, she pulled her arm free of his grasp. She cuddled the Grail like a child with a stuffed animal and stepped defiantly onto the seal. Then she backed across it out of the temple. A moment or two passed, then a deep rumbling sound that was felt as much as heard erupted beneath the temple. The canyon walls started to shake. Dust flew as debris began to tumble from the shaking walls. Elsa spun around, terrified, ran a few steps under the temple. Indy backed away from her as the floor shifted under his feet. He turned and saw one of the massive carved knights shuddering. The pillars rocked. He leapt aside as a stone cap shook loose and tumbled toward him, pulverizing at his feet. Henry was holding his arms above his head, trying to protect himself from the falling rocks. As the floor kept shaking, Brody lost his balance and fell to one knee. Sala grabbed both men by the arms and jerked them away, just as one of the pillars crashed where they had stood. The knight, meanwhile, fled up the stairs toward the passageway and his inner sanctum. Indy signaled the others to hurry toward the entrance. He turned and saw Elsa. She was looking up at one of the swaying columns of stone, her eyes wide with fear. The earth suddenly shifted again, and she lost her balance. She pitched forward, and the Grail cup slipped from her hands. As the cup rolled away from her, a jagged crash seared through the center of the seal and across the temple floor. Elsa struggled to her feet. Her legs straddled the gap, which was slowly widening. The crack split apart the inner steps leading to the passageway and knocked the knight from his feet. He fell back, rolling down the steps. Another crack ruptured the floor of the temple, perpendicular to the first one. Henry toppled like one of the pillars, and Brody wobbled like a drunk next to him. Sala and Indy both froze, uncertain which way to turn. Behind them, the knight crawled laboriously up the steps. The Nazis made a run for the entrance and leapt across the crack that Elsa straddled. It was the same instant she pushed off with one foot, but as she did, the ground bulged on the side she had chosen. She desperately clawed and scratched, searching for a handhold. The Nazis were in the same predicament. They had almost reached the top of the incline when they slid back and fell into the abyss. Their screams echoed long after they were smashed to their deaths below. Elsa clung to a boulder protruding from the side of the crevice. Below her, she could see the Grail cup lying on a rock jutting over the edge of the crack. Instead of climbing up and away from the abyss, she lowered herself on one side of it and reached for the cup. Indy realized the danger she was in and dashed over to her. He stretched out on his stomach and extended his arms, shouting to her to grab his hands. Their fingers brushed. And then he inched forward and clasped both of her gloved hands. He pulled with every bit of strength he had, but it wasn't enough. He started to slide forward. "Junior! Junior!" Henry shouted. "Indy!" Sala bellowed. As Indy pulled, Elsa wrenched one of her hands free. She reached down toward the Grail cup, which rocked back and forth inches from the chasm. Her fingertip grazed the edge of it. "Elsa!" Indy yelled. With his free hand, he grabbed hold of a rock. "I can reach it," she gasped. "I can!" Indy's hold on her was slipping. She stretched toward the cup and was about to grasp it when her glove slipped off her fingers. They each clung to the glove, their hands no longer touching. The glove stretched. It started to rip. "Indy!" Alarm riddled her voice. "Don't let go, please!" The glove ripped more. "Elsa!" He let go of the rock and lunged for her wrist, but it was too late. Her fingers slipped, and she fell backward into the chasm, her screams ringing out in the temple. Indy slid forward, plowing his hands into the earth in a desperate attempt to stop himself from hurtling after her. He was about to slide into the blackness when hands squeezed around his ankles like a vice. "Indy!" Sala yelled. "I've got you. I'm going to pull you out." "Wait!" He reached out for the Grail cup, but his fingers fell several inches short of it. "Lower me a little more." "Don't be crazy, Indy," Sala grunted, struggling to hold on to his friend. His feet were inching forward, and it wasn't because he was trying to lower Indy toward the chalice. "A little more," Indy gasped. "No, Indy, please." "Junior, get back up here," Henry barked from behind Sala. "I can get it. I can reach it. Indiana? Dad?" It was the first time his father had ever called him by name. "Let it go," Henry said calmly. Indy abandoned the Grail and clawed his way backward as Sala pulled at his ankles. The dirt he loosened tumbled down into the Grail cup. He looked up once just in time to see the cup slide off his perch and into the abyss with Elsa. Sala gave one final yank, grunting loudly as he pulled Indy over the lip of the crevice. Indy sprawled on his stomach, staring into the black chasm that had swallowed Elsa in the cup. Henry's hand was tight on his shoulder. His voice was urgent. Come, now. We've got to get out. Indy nodded, picked up his hat, took one more glance over the side, and stood up. Sala guided them forward. Where's Marcus? Henry called out in alarm. I'm here, he said from somewhere nearby. He followed after the others, then noticed that his father had stopped and was staring toward the steps. Indy followed his gaze and saw the gray old knight standing impassively at the top of the steps, a few feet from the jagged crack. Rocks and dust were tumbling around him, but he seemed completely oblivious. The knight raised his right hand, a farewell. It was as if he were saying the last crusade was finally over, and the Grail was safe. He sipped the ambrosial waters from the cup, and had understood. It was the essence of a higher awareness that was in him, and in everyone who bothered to look for it. Now he vowed he would do the best he could with the understanding and knowledge he had gained. Henry smiled back at the knight and nodded. Dad? Indy pulled on his father's arm and hurried him away as massive rocks thundered down around them and pillars collapsed. The walls were crumbling, and jets of steam hissed up through the crevices. But Indy knew they would survive. They had made it this far. They would make the final steps. Henry? Indy? Come on! Brody yelled. Outside the temple. I know the way! We better catch up with him. He got lost in his own museum. I know. Henry gestured to Indy. After you, Junior. Yes, sir, Indy said with a smile. It didn't matter anymore what his father called him. The quest had been fulfilled. For Henry. And especially for Indy. Copyright 1989, Lucasfilms Limited, for use by Dove Books on Tape, Incorporated.
If you enjoyed that, please comment and subscribe, and please